She thought it was just a place to park. I knew it was the exact spot she'd regret choosing. The low rumble of my excavator idled beneath me, a steady mechanical heartbeat vibrating through the steel frame and up into my boots as the early morning air carried that damp, earthy smell of freshly turned soil mixed with diesel fumes, the kind of scent that sticks to your clothes and reminds you exactly where you stand. And right in front of me, under the pale Texas sun just breaking over the horizon, sat a pearl-white SUV slowly sinking an inch at a time into ground that had no intention of holding it. My name is Ethan Cole, and this land, every inch of it, has been in my family for 3 generations, 62 acres of hard-earned dirt just outside a subdivision that showed up about 5 years ago like it had something to prove. All clean sidewalks and matching mailboxes, the kind of place where people measure grass with rulers and call it community pride. But to me, this land isn't just property, it's history, it's sweat. It's the sound of my father's boots crunching gravel at 5 a.m. and the smell of motor oil on his hands as he taught me how to run a machine before I could even reach the pedals. And I've spent my whole life respecting lines, fence lines, property lines, lines you don't cross unless you're ready to deal with what's on the other side. Brenda Whitmore never understood that. She rolled into Willow Creek Estates like she owned the place. HOA president within a year, driving that same white SUV like it was some kind of badge of authority, always smiling like she was doing you a favor while telling you everything you were doing wrong. And from day one, she had a problem with my farm, said it didn't match the aesthetic, said the equipment, the fencing. Even the smell of fertilizer was dragging down property values, like the land had to answer to her instead of the other way around. And at first it was just letters, complaints about noise, about dust, about things that had been here longer than her entire neighborhood combined. But then it turned into something else, something quieter and a lot more deliberate, survey flags showing up where they didn't belong. HOA trucks cutting across my pasture like it was a shortcut, little signs that said future access route hammered into dirt that wasn't theirs. And every time I pushed back, she'd smile that same tight smile and say, "We're just planning for the community's future," like that gave her permission to redraw lines that had been set decades before she ever showed up. The morning she parked her SUV out here, dead center in my lower field where I'd just turned the soil for spring planting, I knew she'd crossed from annoying into something else entirely, something I wasn't going to argue about anymore. Because while she saw empty land waiting to be claimed, I saw a boundary being tested, and I don't raise my voice when that happens. I don't make a scene. I just pay attention, I measure, I document, and I wait, because out here, patience isn't weakness, it's strategy. And as I watched that SUV settle deeper into ground softened by last night's irrigation, the faint hiss of hydraulics under my hand felt less like a tool and more like an answer she hadn't realized she was asking for. The first time I noticed something was off was not the SUV, not the complaints, not even the signs she kept planting like flags in someone else's territory. It was the way the ground itself started telling a different story, the way tire tracks cut across my lower field in patterns that did not belong to any work I had scheduled, wide suburban tires instead of the deep, aggressive tread of farm equipment, curving in lazy arcs like whoever drove them never once thought about where they were, only that they could be there. And that is when I started paying closer attention, not reacting, not confronting, just observing the way I was taught. Because on land like this, you do not guess, you verify. I pulled the original deed from the metal cabinet in my office, the same one my father kept locked with a key he wore around his neck, the paper worn soft at the edges but still clear where it mattered, boundary lines drawn in precise measurements, acres defined down to the foot, no shared access, no easements, nothing that even hinted at permission for anyone outside this family to step foot beyond. The fence line, and I cross-checked it with the county records online, every coordinate matching exactly, every line reaffirming the same simple truth. This land was private, always had been, and no homeowners association with matching mailboxes was going to rewrite that because it was convenient. The next step was documentation, not because I needed proof for myself, but because I knew how people like Brenda operated, loud when challenged, quiet when confronted with facts, and I wanted everything recorded before a single word was said. So I set up trail cameras along the edge of the field, small, weatherproof units mounted just high enough to catch a clear angle of anyone crossing over. The faint click of each device snapping into place, echoing in the still air like a promise I was making to myself that this would not turn into a shouting match. This would be handled clean, precise, undeniable. Within 48 hours, I had everything I needed. Footage of HOA trucks cutting across the grass, tires flattening soil that had taken weeks to prepare, a couple of residents following the same path like it had already been claimed, and then Brenda's SUV, rolling in slow and confident, stopping right in the center like she had finally decided to make it official, like parking there turned assumption into ownership. And the part that stuck with me was not the act itself, it was the way she stepped out, glanced around once, and walked away without hesitation. No note, no call, nothing. Just that same quiet certainty that rules did not apply to her if she believed in what she was doing. I could have called her right then, could have told her to move it, could have escalated the whole thing into one more argument she would twist into something else, but I did not, because by that point I understood the pattern. This was not about a single mistake. It was about testing limits, pushing a little further each time to see where resistance showed up. And the moment you react too early, you give them a line to push against. But if you let them go just far enough, they draw it themselves. And that is exactly what she did, because what she saw as an empty field was actually freshly turned soil, soft beneath the surface from irrigation I had run the night before, planned weeks in advance for planting. And as the sun climbed higher and the temperature started to rise, I watched from the edge of the property as the weight of that SUV began to settle, not dramatically, not all at once, just a slow, almost polite sinking, inch by inch, the kind you would miss if you were not looking for it. And that is when I knew I did not need to stop her. I just needed to let the land do what it has always done, hold its ground for those who respect it, and refuse it for those who do not. I let a full day pass before I did anything, not because I was unsure, but because timing matters more than action when you are dealing with people who think they are always in control. And by the next morning the ground had done exactly what I expected. The SUV had settled another 2 inches, the rear tires now pressed deep enough that the sidewalls bulged slightly. The kind of detail most people would not notice until it was too late. But I noticed everything. The angle, the weight, distribution, the way the soil held just enough to keep it stable while refusing to give it freedom. And that is when the phone started ringing. Not once, not twice, but 3 calls in under 10 minutes, all from numbers tied to the HOA office. And I let each one go to voicemail, because I already knew what they were going to say before they said it. By noon, Brenda showed up in person, her SUV now sitting lower than it had any right to be. The front end tilted just enough to tell the truth she was not ready to accept. And she stepped out with that same tight posture, sunglasses on, phone in hand, like she was walking into a meeting she expected to win. The crunch of gravel under her heels sharp against the quiet field as she approached me where I stood near the fence line, hands resting casually on the rail like I had all the time in the world. "Ethan, we need to talk," she said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of authority, like the conversation had already been decided somewhere in her mind. And I nodded once, not inviting, not resisting, just acknowledging that she had finally come to the right side of the property line to have it. She gestured back toward the SUV, her expression tightening as she saw how much it had sunk, and for a brief second, just a fraction of a moment, I saw something crack beneath that confidence. Not panic, not yet, but awareness, the kind that shows up when reality starts pushing back. "Your field is unstable," she said, like she was filing a report instead of stating the obvious. "This is a safety concern, and you are responsible for maintaining conditions that do not damage community property." I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. The same pattern, redefine the situation, shift the responsibility, speak it like it is already true. And I could hear the faint hum of my excavator behind me, still idling where I left it, a steady mechanical presence that did not argue, did not negotiate, just waited. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded copy of the notice I had prepared the night before, printed clean, dated, documented, every word chosen carefully, and handed it to her without a single extra motion, the paper catching slightly in the breeze before settling in her hand. She glanced down, her eyes moving across the lines, and I watched the shift happen in real time. The moment where assumption meets documentation, where belief runs into fact, and it always looks the same: slower breathing, tighter grip, silence where there used to be certainty. The notice was simple, clear language stating that her vehicle had been left on private property without permission, that she had 24 hours to arrange removal at her own expense, and that any continued presence would be considered trespassing under county code. Nothing aggressive, nothing emotional, just the law written in plain terms she could not reinterpret. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice lower now, controlled but thinner. "We are working on an access plan for this area, and you are interfering with community development." I shook my head once, slow, deliberate, not arguing, just correcting, because this was the part where lines had to be seen, not debated. "There is no access plan," I said, my voice even, steady. "There is no easement, no agreement, no shared use, and there never has been." And I let the silence sit after that, heavy and clear, the kind that does not invite response, only recognition. She looked back at the SUV again, really looked this time, noticing the way the tires were no longer level, the way the soil had started to grip around the edges, and the air shifted, not dramatically, but enough, like the moment before a storm when everything gets just a little too still. And as she stood there holding that notice, I could already see it. She was not thinking about whether she was right anymore. She was thinking about how to get out of something she had walked into on her own. And that was exactly where I needed her to be. She folded the notice once, clean and precise, like she was trying to fold the situation back into something manageable. But the paper did not change what it said, and neither did the ground beneath her vehicle, which had sunk just enough now that the front tires were beginning to press into the softened soil at an angle you could not ignore if you understood how weight worked. And I could see her calculating, not emotionally, but strategically, the way someone does when they realize control is slipping, and they need to find a way to reframe it before anyone else notices. "You cannot just trap a vehicle like this," she said, her voice tightening around the edges, not loud, not yet, but firm in that practiced way she used at HOA meetings, like repeating something made it true. And I leaned lightly against the fence, feeling the rough wood under my palm, steady, unmoved, the same fence line that had been there long before she ever decided this land needed improving. "I did not trap anything," I said, keeping my tone level, because tone matters when facts are on your side. "You parked on active farmland after being told not to cross the boundary. The ground is exactly what it is supposed to be." She glanced down at her shoes, the heels now picking up a thin layer of damp soil, and for the first time she stepped back, just a small movement, but enough to show she was no longer entirely comfortable standing where she had chosen to stand, and that detail mattered more than anything she said out loud. The air carried that familiar mix of sun warming the earth and diesel lingering from the idling excavator, and somewhere in the distance a pickup truck passed along the county road, its tires humming over asphalt, a reminder that the world outside this field kept moving while this moment stayed locked in place. "We can resolve this," she said after a pause, shifting her weight, her phone still in her hand but no longer raised like a tool. "There is no need to escalate this into something unnecessary." I nodded once, because that was the first honest thing she had said, even if she did not realize it, and I pushed off the fence, walking a few steps closer, not aggressive, not rushed, just closing the distance enough to make the line between us clear. "That notice gives you 24 hours, I said, tapping the folded paper lightly with 2 fingers. "You can call a tow company, you can bring in equipment, you can handle it however you want, as long as it stays within your responsibility." She let out a breath that sounded controlled but carried a hint of frustration underneath, the kind that builds when someone realizes their usual methods are not working, and she looked past me toward the excavator, really looking this time, taking in the bucket, the tracks, the position it was sitting in like it had already been placed with purpose, and I could almost see the connection forming, not fully, not yet, but enough to make her uneasy. "And if it is not moved?" she asked, her voice quieter now, measured, like she was testing the edges of the answer before committing to it. I let a second pass before responding, not to create drama, but because silence has weight when used right, and I wanted that weight to settle. "Then it stays exactly where it is," I said, "on private property, documented, recorded, and handled according to the law." And I did not need to say more than that, because the implication was already there, clear as the boundary line she had chosen to ignore. She looked back at the SUV again, the sun reflecting off the white paint now broken by thin lines of dirt creeping up along the lower panels, and the ground beneath it held firm in its quiet refusal, not collapsing, not shifting, just holding it exactly where it had settled. And in that moment, the entire situation had changed shape. No longer something she could talk her way out of, no longer a misunderstanding she could redefine, but a position she had placed herself in, 1 inch at a time, until there was nowhere left to step without consequences following her. And as she stood there with that notice in her hand and the field stretching out around her, I could tell she was starting to understand that this was not about winning an argument anymore. It was about getting out of a problem she had created, and for the first time since this started, she did not look like the one in charge. She did not argue after that, not right away, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said, because people like Brenda only go quiet when they are recalculating, when they are looking for a different angle to approach the same problem. And I watched her step back toward the SUV, her heels pressing into the soft soil just enough to leave marks that would not hold shape for long, the ground shifting slightly under her weight, like it was reminding her again that this was not solid territory, not for her. And she circled the vehicle once, slow, deliberate, her phone now raised as she took photos, not of the situation, but of how she could present it later, framing, adjusting, capturing just enough to tell a version of the story that fit her narrative. But even from where I stood, I could see the problem she could not photograph away. The tires were no longer sitting evenly. The rear end had dropped another inch, and the undercarriage was closer to the soil than any road was designed to handle. About 30 minutes later, the first truck showed up, a mid-sized tow rig from a company I recognized from town, the kind that handles roadside calls, not situations like this, and the driver stepped out, took one look at the SUV, then at the ground, and I could see it in his posture before he even spoke, that subtle shift from confidence to caution, the way his shoulders squared up as he walked closer, boots pressing into the same soft earth that had already made its point. And Brenda met him halfway, talking fast, pointing, explaining, her hand cutting through the air in sharp motions like she could direct the outcome if she just said it clearly enough. The driver crouched near the rear tire, pressed his hand lightly into the soil, then stood back up and shook his head once, slow, firm, and even from a distance I could read his lips well enough to catch the important part. I cannot pull it out like this. And Brenda's posture stiffened immediately, her head tilting slightly as if she had misheard him, which she had not, and she said something back, sharper this time, her tone rising just enough to carry across the field, but he did not change. His stance did not move toward his equipment, just stood there and repeated himself with the same calm certainty, the kind that comes from experience, not opinion. I walked over then, not rushing, just closing the distance as the diesel engine of my excavator idled behind me, that steady hum filling the space between us like a constant reminder of what tools were available and who understood how to use them. And the driver glanced at me as I approached, recognition flickering for a second before settling into something more neutral, professional. "Ground is too soft," he said, gesturing toward the SUV. "If I try to pull it from here, I risk more damage, and I am not equipped for recovery like this." Brenda turned toward me immediately, seizing on the word damage like it was a lever she could use. "You hear that?" she said, her voice sharper now. "Your field is causing damage to my vehicle. You are responsible for this." I held her gaze for a second, then looked back at the driver, not dismissing her, just choosing where the conversation actually mattered. "He is right," I said calmly. "This is not a standard tow. This is recovery on private land, different equipment, different setup." And the driver nodded once in agreement, clearly more interested in the practical side than the argument forming around it. "I can call a heavy recovery unit," he added, "but it will not be cheap, and they will need access clearance and stable ground to operate." The word clearance hung there for a second, and I could see Brenda hesitate, just a fraction, because now the situation had shifted again, from something she thought she could control to something that required permission, my permission, and that was not a position she was used to being in. I stepped back slightly, giving the space back to her, not pressing, not pushing, just letting the reality sit where it was, solid and unmoving, like the boundary she had crossed. And as the engine behind me continued its steady rhythm and the sun climbed higher, drying the top layer of soil while leaving the deeper ground soft and unyielding, It became clear that this was no longer about getting the SUV out quickly. It was about how much it was going to cost her to undo a decision she had made, without thinking it all the way through. And for the first time since she walked onto this land, every option in front of her came with a price she could not talk her way around. The tow truck left after about 15 minutes, the driver giving me a small nod before climbing back into his cab, diesel engine rumbling as he pulled away down the county road, leaving behind nothing but tire marks on gravel and a problem that had not moved an inch, and the silence that followed felt heavier somehow, like the field itself had settled into what it already knew was coming. And Brenda stood there watching the truck disappear, her arms crossed now, phone lowered, the confidence she walked in with replaced by something tighter, something more controlled, like she was holding back frustration that had nowhere useful to go. She turned back toward me slowly, the sun catching the edge of her sunglasses as she spoke again, her voice measured but sharper than before. This is not over, Ethan. You are interfering with a planned development corridor, and I will have the board review this immediately. And I could hear the shift in her words, not certainty anymore, but escalation, reaching for authority that did not apply here. And I let her finish without interruption, because sometimes the best response is letting someone hear themselves clearly. There is nothing to review, I said calmly, the same steady tone I had used from the start. There is no corridor, no approval, no documentation, just assumptions and tire tracks. And I could see that land on her, not dramatically, but enough to make her jaw tighten slightly as she looked past me again, this time not at the excavator, but at the open stretch of field behind it, like she was trying to imagine it as something else, something she could still claim. The heat had started to build by then, late afternoon sun pressing down, drying the surface layer of soil while the deeper ground stayed soft and holding, the kind of condition that looks stable until you understand what is underneath. And I walked over to the excavator, resting my hand briefly on the metal frame, feeling the warmth from the engine, the faint vibration still running through it like a quiet pulse. And I climbed into the cab without rushing, not making a show of it, just moving, with purpose the same way I had done 1,000 times before. From up there, the view changed slightly, not in distance, but in perspective, and I could see the full picture clearly. The SUV sitting off level, the ground around it uneven, the line where the soil shifted from firm to soft, all the small details that added up to one simple fact. It was not going anywhere without the right approach, and that approach required knowledge, not authority. Brenda stepped closer as I adjusted the controls, the faint hiss of hydraulics responding to the slightest movement of my hand, and she raised her voice just enough to carry over the engine. You are not seriously going to make this worse, she said, the edge back in her tone, but thinner now, less certain, and I looked down at her from the cab, not dismissive, just steady. The way you look at someone who is still trying to argue with a situation that has already been decided. I am not making anything worse, I said, my voice even over the hum of the machine. I am making sure it stays exactly where it belongs until it is handled correctly. And that was the difference she still did not want to accept. This was not about escalation. It was about containment, about keeping the problem from spreading beyond the boundaries she had already crossed. I eased the bucket down slowly, not touching the vehicle, not even close, just positioning it near the edge of the disturbed soil, the metal teeth pressing lightly into the ground with a dull, controlled sound, and I began to move the earth around the perimeter, careful, precise, creating space where there had been none, not trapping, not damaging, just reshaping the surface so the situation became exactly what it already was. A vehicle sitting in the middle of private farmland without permission and without an easy way out. The soil shifted in slow, deliberate movements, each pass of the bucket pulling it back, forming a shallow boundary around the SUV, visible, undeniable. And as the engine continued its steady rhythm and the smell of diesel mixed with fresh earth filled the air, I could feel the moment settle into place, not dramatic, not loud, just final in a way that did not need explanation. And when I looked back down, Brenda was no longer speaking, no longer directing, just watching as the field, my field, quietly reasserted exactly where the line had always been. By the time the sun dipped lower and the light shifted from harsh white to that warm amber that stretches shadows across the field, the shape of the situation had changed completely, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because everything had settled exactly where it was supposed to. The SUV now sitting in a shallow cradle of turned earth, not damaged, not touched, just surrounded by ground that no longer offered a simple path out. And I shut down the excavator with a slow turn of the key, the engine winding down from its steady rumble into silence, leaving behind that faint ticking sound of cooling metal and the smell of diesel hanging in the air like the last word in a conversation that did not need repeating. Brenda had not left, and that in itself said a lot, because people like her usually retreat the moment control slips too far, but instead she stayed near the edge of the field, pacing in short, controlled steps, phone pressed to her ear now, her voice low but urgent, and I did not need to hear every word to understand the tone. She was explaining, justifying, trying to pull authority from somewhere outside this field to solve a problem that existed entirely within it. About 20 minutes later, another vehicle arrived, not a tow truck this time, but a county sheriff's SUV, dust trailing behind it as it rolled up and came to a stop near the fence line, and I watched as the deputy stepped out, adjusting his hat against the fading light, his eyes scanning the field, taking in the excavator, the SUV, the disturbed soil, and then settling on Brenda as she walked toward him with quick, purposeful steps, already talking before she even reached him, her hand gesturing back toward the vehicle like she was presenting evidence in her favor. The deputy listened without interrupting, his posture relaxed but attentive, and when she finished, he turned his gaze toward me, giving a small nod before walking over, boots crunching softly over the gravel and then sinking just slightly as he stepped onto the softer ground. And I met him halfway, not defensive, not eager, just steady, the same way I had handled everything else up to this point. "Evening," he said, his voice calm, professional, the kind that carries weight without needing to raise volume. And I returned the greeting, the air between us clear, uncomplicated, because facts have a way of simplifying things when they are laid out properly. He asked a few questions, simple ones, about property lines, about permission, about how long the vehicle had been there, and I answered each one directly, no extra details, no emotion, just the sequence of events exactly as they happened. And then I handed him a copy of the notice, along with a printout of the property map I had pulled earlier, the lines marked clean and precise, showing exactly where the boundary sat in relation to where the SUV now rested. He studied it for a moment, then glanced back toward the vehicle, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the position, the angle, the surrounding soil, and then he walked over to inspect it more closely, crouching near the rear tire, pressing his hand into the ground just like the tow driver had done, feeling the same softness, the same resistance. And when he stood back up, there was no confusion in his expression, just a quiet understanding of what he was looking at. Brenda stepped in again at that point, her voice sharper now, frustration edging into it as she tried to redirect the situation, talking about community plans, about shared access, about responsibility, but the deputy held up a hand gently, not dismissing her, just pausing her long enough to bring the conversation back to where it needed to be. And when he spoke, his tone did not change, still calm, still even, but there was a finality to it that cut through everything else. "Ma'am," he said, "this is private property, and without documented permission or an easement, you cannot leave a vehicle here." And the words hung there in the cooling air, simple, direct, and impossible to reinterpret, and I watched as that landed on her, not all at once, but enough to shift something deeper, because this was no longer a disagreement between neighbors or a matter she could escalate through her usual channels. This was the line drawn by someone who had no stake in the argument, only in the facts. And as the last light of the day stretched across the field and the shadows grew longer around the SUV, it became clear that everything had aligned exactly where it needed to, not because I forced it, but because I let it unfold the way it was always going to when the truth was given enough space to stand on its own. The deputy let that silence sit for a moment after his words, the kind of pause that gives reality time to settle in, and I watched Brenda's posture shift again, not as sharp as before, not as certain, her shoulders tightening slightly as she looked from him to the SUV and back again like she was trying to find a version of this where she still had control, but there was nothing left to reinterpret, no angle that changed what was already clear. "So what are my options?" she asked finally, her voice lower now, measured in a way that sounded less like authority and more like calculation, and the deputy glanced once more at the vehicle, then at the ground around it, his expression steady, practical. "You will need to arrange proper recovery," he said. "Heavy equipment, controlled access, and permission from the property owner." And he nodded slightly in my direction when he said that last part, not emphasizing it, just acknowledging the obvious. And that small motion carried more weight than anything else said so far. Brenda followed his gaze toward me, and for a second she just stood there, the wind moving lightly across the field, carrying that mix of dry grass and turned soil. The air cooler now as evening settled in, and I could see the moment she realized that every path forward went through the same point, not around it, not over it, but directly through it. "Fine," she said after a breath, the word coming out controlled but tight, like it cost more than she wanted to admit. "Then I will arrange for the proper equipment," and she paused, just long enough to make the next part deliberate. "With your cooperation." I did not answer immediately, not to create tension, but because clarity matters more than speed in moments like this, and I stepped closer to the fence again, resting my hand on the same worn wood, grounding the conversation back where it belonged. "Access can be arranged," I said, my voice steady. "Even with written agreement, liability coverage, and confirmation of scope." And I kept it simple, no extra words, no emotion, just the conditions that made sense for the land and the situation, and I saw it again. That brief tightening in her expression, not surprise, but resistance meeting structure, the kind that cannot be pushed through without consequence. The deputy gave a small nod, clearly satisfied that the direction was now practical instead of argumentative, and he stepped back slightly, giving both of us space, his role shifting from intervention to observation now that the facts had done their work. Brenda exhaled slowly, looking back at her SUV one more time. The way it sat there unchanged, quiet, unmoving, the shallow boundary of soil around it catching the last light of the day. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just present in a way that could not be ignored. And for the first time since this started, she did not try to redefine it, did not try to claim it as something else. She just saw it for what it was. "You will have the agreement by morning," she said, her voice more controlled now, less edge, more precision, like she had finally shifted from assumption to process. And I nodded once, not as approval, not as concession, just acknowledgement that she had stepped into the only path that had ever been available. The deputy turned then, heading back toward his vehicle, boots crunching lightly as he moved off the softer ground, and the fading sunlight stretched long shadows across the field, the kind that make everything look more defined, more honest. And as his engine started and the red and blue lights flickered briefly before shutting off, the scene settled into something quieter, something resolved in its direction even if not yet in its outcome. Brenda stood there a moment longer, then turned without another word, walking back toward the edge of the property, her steps slower now, more careful, as if she finally understood that every inch of this ground mattered. And as she reached the fence line and paused briefly before stepping back onto what she considered safe territory, I stayed where I was, listening to the evening settle in, the distant hum of the road, the faint rustle of wind through dry grass, and behind me, the excavator sat still and silent, its work already done without ever needing to touch what was never supposed to be there in the first place. The next morning came in quiet, the kind of early light that rolls across open land like it has all the time in the world, and I was already out by the fence line with a cup of coffee in my hand, the steam mixing with the cool air while the field sat exactly as I left it, undisturbed, the SUV still resting in its shallow cradle of earth, unchanged except for the way the soil had firmed slightly along the edges overnight, holding its shape more clearly now, like the land itself had finished, settling into its decision. Around 9, the first truck rolled in, not the small tow rig from before, but a full heavy recovery unit, wide tires, reinforced winch system, the kind of equipment built for situations where weight and ground conditions actually matter. And behind it came a second vehicle, a flatbed carrying additional stabilizing gear, everything moving slower, more deliberate. No assumptions this time, just process. Brenda stepped out from the passenger side, dressed the same as always, composed, controlled, but there was a difference in how she moved now, more measured, more aware of where she placed each step, and she held a folder in her hand as she walked toward me, not rushing, not hesitating, just following the path that had finally been made clear to her. "Here is the agreement," she said, handing it over, her voice steady, stripped of the edge it carried before, and I took it, flipping through the pages, reading each line carefully. Liability coverage confirmed, scope defined, acknowledgement of private property stated in plain language, everything documented the way it should have been from the start, and I nodded once when I was done, folding it back neatly before handing it to the recovery supervisor for reference. The operation itself was slow, careful, almost quiet in the way professionals handle something that could go wrong if rushed, stabilizing mats laid down to distribute weight, winch lines set at precise angles, the hum of engines low and controlled instead of aggressive, and I stood off to the side, watching, not interfering, just observing the way experience and respect for the situation replaced the kind of shortcuts that had caused all of this in the first place. It took over an hour to free the SUV completely, the ground resisting just enough to remind everyone involved that it had not given in easily, but eventually the vehicle was lifted, guided, and secured onto the flatbed, dirt clinging to the lower panels, not damage, just evidence, and as it rolled away slowly toward the road, the field returned to stillness behind it. The disturbed soil left as the only visible sign that anything had happened at all. Brenda did not say much after that, just a brief nod in my direction before turning to follow the truck, her steps steady, no longer rushed, and there was no need for anything else, no argument, no final word, because everything that needed to be said had already been handled through action, through process, through letting reality take its course without interference. I walked back out into the field once the equipment cleared, boots pressing into the soil that was already beginning to dry under the late morning sun, and I could see the outline where the SUV had been, the impression it left behind not as damage, but as a reminder, a clear shape marking exactly where a line had been crossed and then corrected. I climbed back into the excavator one last time, easing the bucket down to level the ground, smoothing out the edges, returning the field to what it was meant to be, each pass deliberate, controlled, restoring the surface without erasing the lesson, because land like this remembers, even if people try not to. By the time I shut the engine down again, the field looked almost untouched, just another stretch of soil ready for planting, quiet, steady, exactly as it should be. And as I stood there looking out over it, the only thing that stayed with me was how simple it had always been. She thought she could use the land because it was there, but in the end, it was never about the land being empty. It was about who understood it, respected it, and knew exactly where the line was drawn, because out here, that line does not move. It just waits for someone to realize they crossed it.